Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, The Power of Pre-Routing, Pitfalls, Performance, and Last Mile Progress. My name is Kelly Diasis, and I'm thrilled to have you with us today. Joining us is Jake Steele with ORTEC Data Science and Consulting. He'll guide us through today's session, sharing his insights and strategies to transform your last mile delivery performance. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive in. Today's session will be approximately 45 minutes. Also, we encourage you to ask questions. You'll notice a Q&A box on your screen. Feel free to type your questions there at any time during the presentation, and we'll address those during the dedicated Q&A segment at the end of the webinar. Also, a recording will be made available to you after the webinar. And as an added bonus for attending live, we will provide a QR code to download our last mile data playbook after the Q&A portion of the webcast. And now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Jake. Jake, the digital floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Really excited to jump in and talk a little bit about pre-routing, and talk about a little bit about pitfalls, performance, and just in general how we can improve our last mile without actually touching the optimization. So just to set expectations, I'll be doing a little introduction, then we're going to be jumping in and talking about some supply chain bottlenecks, then what we call pre-routing levers, and then talking about how you guys can actually implement some of these changes with your own data and in your own supply chain solutions. Finally, we'll end with Q&A. So who am I and why should you listen to me on this topic? So I'm Jake. I've been at ORTEC in the data science and consulting department for about 8 years now. And if you're not familiar with consulting, we do tailor-made solutions, analytics, and studies. So everything that's not our standard enterprise solutions, we get to come in and get the most out of your data, build cool projects, and in general, just deliver more value at our partners. So I'm a computer scientist. My degree is in computer science and computer engineering. So I spend a lot of time working on projects where we actually get to dig into the details and figure out how to move the needle forward. So with that in mind, let's actually jump in and talk a little bit about supply chain bottlenecks, because when we look at our supply chain, there are all these different things that we can do to make a positive impact. And oftentimes we can get stuck in looking at the optimization as a way to improve our routing and get better last mile results. And what we actually see is there's different things that need to happen here. So instead of only looking at the optimization, we also need to start to look at the input, but then also the execution and the change management that goes along with that optimization. I think if you're going from no optimization to some optimization, there's huge value in that. But a lot of routing solutions today are really good. And so if we want to continue to get results and continue to take full advantage of them, then we need to start getting creative in the way that we're improving these solutions. So if we take a brief look at the last mile delivery process, there are a lot of different things here that are happening. So obviously we have our data inputs that are fed into the optimization, and then we have some kind of driver execution. And then if we combine those three things, we have our costs. And obviously the ultimate goal is to drive down those costs as much as possible. And I think when we're looking at pre-routing, we're going to be focusing a lot on the inputs and everything that we're actually feeding into the optimization. So if we're looking at improving last mile efficiency just overall, the three big areas we can improve are the data quality, the optimization quality, and the change management aspect. I know there's a lot of cases where you have a really great optimization and then the drivers don't follow it, and there's a lot of back and forth there. So through this pre-routing process, the hope is that we can actually go from inputs to execution in a way that is more effective. And by focusing on these bottlenecks, we can actually get better ROI than trying to tune the optimization more and more and more with some lower hanging fruit. So that's going to be the topic for today. So as we talked about a little bit, these are the three kind of pillars of what we're trying to do with pre-routing. And I want to talk a little bit about the traditional approach here, because having bad inputs, or not even bad inputs, but just inputs that are suboptimal, like inaccurate location data or tight time windows, can actually result in a waterfall effect as we go down the process. And so if we have that suboptimal input data, we'll produce what we would say are good routes. But in reality, they're not realistic routes. And that creates a problem because what seemed really good becomes inefficient. And we see drivers that are frustrated, and we see costs go up, we see stops get skipped. And what we really need to do is transition that so that we have clean, accurate inputs and realistic constraints. And if we do that, we don't just create good routes, we create smart routes. And the difference here is that the smart routes are achievable and they're efficient. And so a big part of this is making sure that we have the right number of stops on the route and having a smooth execution. And overall, this will lower cost, have happier drivers, and we'll be hitting more time windows. And so we'll have higher customer satisfaction. So this all starts at the base of the pyramid, because if the data that goes in is bad, then the optimization might be great, but you can't get the results that you need. And then the execution and change management, it can be very frustrating. And so again, we are sitting in an office a lot of times using math, trying to be smart, but that's not just what we're doing here. We need to actually see, how is this impacting the people who are driving? How is this impacting the supply chain as a whole? And that's a big part of what we're trying to do is bridge that gap between the office and the execution. And so by actually spending a little bit of time on the data that goes into the optimization, we can actually improve the quality of our routes before we even run the optimization. And through that, we'll actually improve the execution of the routes as well. So one of the big topics here is pre-routing levers, and actually the data that we're going to look at and the variables we're going to play with to drive change within our supply chain. So you guys are probably going to be really familiar with these, especially if you're constantly, looking at your fleet and your depots and what's coming in and going out. And so some of these you're going to hear and you'll say, yeah, that's an obvious problem. Other ones you might hear and be like, wow, I haven't really thought of it that way. So when we talk about location, what we're looking at is actually geocode. So the big thing here is we want to make sure that the locations on our map reflect the actual coordinates. I always imagine, like, when I go and visit my family in the middle of nowhere in rural Kentucky, you type it in the GPS, and in reality, it's like 1.5 miles from the location on the map. Thankfully, our commercial maps are better than that, but it's always frustrating when you think you're arriving at the destination, which is actually a little bit further down the road, right? The next one we'll talk about is time windows, and understanding how time windows can actually really be a big lever in your optimization. And if we widen those time windows, how that can lower cost. And then also give you some negotiating power to go back to your sales force or your customer service force and say, hey, this is why time windows matter, and this is how we need to start approaching time windows, because we recognize that's not just a math problem, that's also a challenge that you have to interface with the customer and get them to agree to those changes. Then we have safety stock. If you're in the oil and gas industry, then you're going to be really familiar with this. It's essentially understanding, how often should I be visiting a location, and are we going to be meeting that safety stock requirement? Something that we see a lot is safety stock is too high, and so we're making stops that we don't need to make to customers, and in general, that just pushes costs up. And you don't even realize it, because the route is still efficient in the optimizer, but if you could just remove the stop, then your overall mileage will be lower. And then we have things like fillers. So after the must goes on a truck, what are the should goes and could goes, and how can we actually optimize that to either increase margin, reduce mileage, or have a better impact overall in the supply chain. And then finally, in the bonus one that wasn't in all the pre-webinar marketing is stop times. So how can we realistically plan routes, and how can we realistically plan stops so that we're getting the right number of stops on a route, and consistently doing that, right? Because if you have too many, then you're going to see driver overtime, or customers will be getting late deliveries. But if you have too few, then it's suboptimal because you're not taking full advantage of the driver, right? And so we need to find that balance on how much are we stopping, and how can we incorporate that in to improve our routing. So we're going to go through all of these different topics a little bit more in depth now, starting with location analysis. So we've seen a big improvement in location data over recent years, but in your routing solution, a big point of improvement can be fixing your geocodes. So one, that's understanding if you're using addresses instead of geocodes, it's great to actually measure the geocodes through whether that's a geofence or some kind of break to validate that the truck is where it needs to be. And then you can feed that back in your master data so that every time you visit that customer afterwards, you know you're going to the right location. Another thing is removing duplicate addresses. So we've seen where people have multiple addresses for the same customer. Maybe they moved down the street and the entry was created incorrectly. And so we need to make sure that we're consolidating this and finding the right spot effectively. And then finally, we want to make sure we're delivering to defined delivery points. So we need to know, are we going to the door, the dock, the side of the building? We want to be very precise with this because garbage in is garbage out. If we don't have clean location data, then we're going to end up at the wrong spot. And I think something that's important to note is it doesn't actually take a ton of difference to see good improvements here. So sometimes, there's two different customers you're delivering to, but they actually share an alley and you can go through and hit both of them, versus going to one and then exiting and going to another. And so there's small things like this that actually can improve how the route is built just by having slightly better locations. The next topic here is time window analysis. And this is actually one of the most interesting because if I went and talked to our customers, what I hear consistently is we know time windows are a problem, but we're not sure how to fix them. And this is because it's not just time windows from an operational standpoint. Time windows, you're actually engaging with the customer because there's some kind of contract in place typically where you need to deliver within a set time window, and you have to engage with the sales team because it's way easier for them to sell, oh, you want it from 10 to noon, here it is, versus, hey, we're going to make a stop sometime during the day, your team needs to be ready. And so if we're actually able to associate some kind of cost with the tighter time windows, then we're able to go to our sales team or to our customer service team and say, hey, here are the numbers. This is why we're pushing for these wider time windows and how we can approach and how we approach our delivery. Now, there's different ways to get customers to get on board with this. Sometimes it could be a credit. Other times, it's just going to them and saying, hey, we would like to make this change because of XYZ. But what we found is that if you're going to widen the time windows, it's great because you're going to have less idle time. You're going to have routes that are more concrete. There's no crisscrossing going back to a spot you were closer to earlier because of conflicting time windows. And overall, it'll push the cost down. Now, the important piece of this, because if we recognize time windows are a problem and we want to attach a cost to that, it's so we can show the stakeholders. And it's so we can actually start to balance service levels with cost. I think there's always these organizational conversations that happen with this. But if we're able to balance that service level with cost, then you're going to see better results. I had a professor in college, and he always said that engineering is about trade-offs. And I think that's true too about business and about sales and about customer service, is there's always price to effectiveness trade-off that we want to make sure we're optimizing. And so a great way to get better results in your optimizer is just to widen the time windows. And to do that, obviously, we're going to have to go to the customers and get them to agree. So the next topic is safety stock analysis. So if you're in oil and gas, I'm sure you've seen this time and time again, but it's effectively removing stops from your routes. And so in this instance, we're not looking at the mileage of an individual route, but we're looking more at the mileage of the route and the fleet as a whole and how we can reduce those. And so what we see a lot of times is we're very afraid of stockouts and the repercussions that come with that. If we have a big customer, we don't want them to be upset, right? Because they ran out of what they needed, and so and as a result, what we see is over delivery. So maybe we're going there every day, or even multiple times a day to make sure tanks are always topped off. This produces a lot of extra trips, and sometimes can result in more overtime, more hours for drivers, just because the routes are bigger, right? And so if we're able to take the routes and shrink them, or have the same route but to a place that we were expecting to stop tomorrow, then we're going to see better results. And so what you can actually see here is a fleet reduction or a workforce reduction, because you're doing less work, but you're getting the same results. And so through this, you're actually able to prioritize based on consumption patterns rather than a gut feel. And so in this instance, what we have on the screen is like you would skip this full stop because the tank is nearly full, and you would prioritize the low tank. And so if you're able to do this, you can actually see a huge reduction in stop counts. Now, I will tell you, when we put these statistics together, we always go from no optimization to optimization, and you see these really big numbers, because 15 to 20% sounds huge. If you already have a lot of optimization in place, you probably won't see a 20% stop reduction, right? But if there's no optimization in place, then you can see results that would really blow you away. And in general, I think safety stock analysis is a place where you can see huge results. We have this built into OIR, right, where we're actually forecasting what the tank should be, and it blows me away if we have customers that don't use it, because there's such a value add to understanding, should I be making the stop at this customer at this time? So the next topic here is filler analysis. And I think filler analysis is really interesting. So this might not be as applicable for the oil and gas folks, but if you're in the retail and wholesale space, it's really interesting, because when you're sending a truck somewhere, you obviously have orders that must go. And then you have the big question, which is, okay, we have extra space on the truck. How do we decide what else should be on it? And there's a trade-off here, right? Because we can look at adding items to the truck that prevent a future trip, okay? But we can also look at tweaking the items on the truck to send higher margin items. So there's a balance between, hey, do we want to reduce the cost of the trip, or do we want to increase the margin of the trip? And so it's really interesting, because you can look at this both ways. And I've spoken to customers who some want to really push down the cost of the trip, while some want to maximize and put the most valuable products on the truck to get every dollar they can, because they can't keep up with the reduction, or their production can't keep up with the demand. And so if we're looking at fillers, we're trying to balance the loads. We're trying to maximize stop density, avoid the one-stop routes, but we're also looking to push the profit margins up as much as possible and reduce the total expense of the route. And so I think this is really interesting, and I think this is an area that a lot of people stand to benefit, is just taking a more strategic look at how they're filling their trucks. I think Load Builder is an amazing first step, and I think getting into what can we do to optimize the business after that is a really good second step as you're building your routes. So now we get to talk about stop time learning. I think stop times are really interesting, because they're going to vary a ton across industries, and they're going to vary a ton depending on what exactly you're trying to do. But I think one of the big challenges we see is that a lot of optimizers assume stop times are fixed historically, and reality is a lot messier than that. So some drivers are really quick, right? And they're in and out, and some aren't. And then sometimes you're delivering and maybe there's a receptionist that loves to chat, and that stop takes a little bit longer because they're always talking to the driver, right? And so a crucial part of this is looking at the fixed time for a stop, but also adding a variable time and then measuring within a certain margin of error, because we're people, things happen. A stop is never going to take exactly 15 minutes or exactly 10 minutes or an hour or whatever it is for your respective industry. There's going to be some variability there, but our goal here is to reduce the variability as much as possible and create routes that have the right number of stops. This is really important for a few reasons. So one, we want drivers to be happy, and we want them to get off on time and feel like they can actually get through the routes that they have set. This is really important because it can reduce churn, but it can also push overtime down a little bit, which alleviates cost. In general, it also just boosts customer satisfaction because, and I say this from a personal level, but also as a professional in the supply chain industry. When you're looking at your phone and you expect your package at 2, and then all of a sudden it's coming at 4, and then at 6, and then at 10, and then it's not coming until tomorrow, that creates a lot of frustration. And so what we're really trying to do here is align reality with align the plan with reality, and overall we can get better results when we do things like this. So if you're not looking at stop times and incorporating that into your routing, I would really suggest taking a look at that, because you can get some really good results in this way. So the next question that we get here is, how do we actually implement this, and how can you start doing this yourselves? So I would recommend this 5-step framework for like routing enhancements or pre-routing analytics, because what we want to do is we want to actually take the operational data we have, and we want to validate that the changes that we're making we actually make sense, and they actually provide the value and the results that we want to get. As an example, if we're looking at time windows and we spend all this effort opening up time windows by 2 hours each, but then we don't actually get any benefits from that, it's not an exercise that's worth doing. And so we want to validate as quickly as possible, is the change that we would like to make and is the hypothesis we're making aligned with the end result that we're hoping to achieve. And so through this, the way we typically recommend is to actually export the master data from your optimization tool. So that way we have an idea of like location, time windows, order data, all of that good stuff, because it closely simulates volume, and you have all those historicals. And then we actually do the analytics outside of there. So we're looking for patterns, we're cleaning up data, we're making changes, and doing the development around that. And then we're going to actually create a clone of the database that we got originally. And then we're going to take the new data that has all the analytics, whether that is the new stop times or time windows or safety stock, and we're going to plug that back in. And so when we do that, we can actually rerun the optimization and validate the results and see if they work from an operational sense. Again, I can't overemphasize how important it is. Yes, we're doing all of this math. Yes, we're trying to make smart decisions in the office, but that doesn't matter if we're not able to actually execute and manage those changes in the field. And so we're trying to bridge that gap here through this testing process. And then we move that master data back into production. And so in theory, like if you're an ORTEC customer, you can do a lot of these analytics yourself, and we can help you load those pieces of data back into the environment, or we could also help do these analytics, right? That's the great part about data science and consulting is anything you're trying to solve, we can take a look at those challenges and help you come up with a solution. So just to recap this slide, we're looking at risk-free testing. So we want to make sure we're not messing up any operational data. We're looking at the analytics to make quantifiable decisions, and then we're going through this in an iterative refinement cycle. And when I say that, what I mean is I would start by step 1 saying, hey, let's audit the location data and make sure all of our locations are up to date. Let's make sure we're using geocodes instead of addresses. And then we can actually see how much better is our route? How many fewer miles do we have based on these changes? After that, then look at time windows and say, okay, now if we widen time windows, what's the result? And then take a look at safety stock. I think one of the big challenges when we work with customers is we'll get, hey, our data is a mess. We want to improve every data point. I think that is really admirable. And I think you should be working to improve your data quality as a whole. However, when you change everything, it makes it really hard to measure what is the benefit of this specific change and are we getting the ROI for the effort we're putting into this area. And so if you segment it, you have the smaller changes, which makes it easier for the drivers to actually run with those versus we're changing everything at once and now the routes look different. They don't understand why the expectations are what they are, and they're in a slightly different spot than they were before. And so we want to minimize that as much as possible, and make the change gradually. There's that old analogy about boiling a frog. Like you start it in lukewarm water and then you turn up the heat. And so same thing with your analytics. You want to make changes slowly, and then all of a sudden it's a completely different supply chain. So what are your next steps, and where do you go from here? So I would encourage everyone to take a look at these data points internally first and look at your own pre-routing analysis. And I think if this is something that is challenging, obviously, like I said before, ORTEC is always here to help. We're able to do these types of analysis for you, but a lot of data science departments are capable of running these types of tests. But if you need help reviewing data, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help make changes. And that doesn't just stop at the pre-routing analytics side. That extends. We're happy to collaborate, whether that means consulting, co-piloting, or just sharing ideas. Our goal is to be a thought partner for all of our customers and help drive organizational change. So with that being said, I think now we can open it up for some Q&A.
All right, thank you, Jake, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. We did have a couple of questions come through the registration page, so we'll go ahead and address those. But in the meantime, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box. If we don't get to your questions today, we will follow up with an email shortly after the webinar. Okay, so Jake, the first question that came through the registration page was, what about seasonal variations or demand spikes?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And obviously, there are different ways that we can look at seasonal variation depending on what type of pre-routing analytics you're using. So I think if we're pointing to something like safety stock analysis with propane as an example, when everyone's heating their house, the usage is going to be way higher in the winter. And so I think what's really important is we're going to be building systems that learn as they go versus making one single change. And so depending on what we're doing, if it's a system that is self-learning, kind of like stop time learning or safety stock analysis, then you can build it to learn about the seasonality. But if it's a study, then we can build the study with historicals to understand this is low period, this is high period, and this is how that changes the data. And then you can actually build your routes with those fixes in mind.
All right. The next question that we received was, is this industry specific or does it work for all industries?
So I think if you're looking at pre-routing and data quality as a whole, that is important to do regardless of your industry. So, location data, if you're delivering goods, that's really important. Time windows, for the most part, important. There are some industries where, you're pulling up to a tank and so no one has to be there, so it might not be as relevant. But in general, if you're doing a better job with location data, stop time data, and I guess a better way to say it, if you're getting to the right place at the right time with the right stuff and only going when you need to, then you're going to see better results. And so regardless of industry, I think pre-routing is really important.
All right. The next question we received was, can we do this internally instead of hiring consultants?
So I would say most of the time the answer is yes. So that's the great part about the pre-routing stuff is we have all of the master data. One of the only cases where that's not the case is if we actually are looking at locations. If you're not measuring the actuals, it gets a little bit more difficult. But a lot of data science teams can do some of this work themselves. And so we've seen both. So we've seen situations where our customers will do some of it themselves, and then we'll feed that back into our system. We've also seen situations where our customer doesn't want to be the one that does it, and then we'll do it and feed it back into the system. So I would say the answer is it depends on your data maturity level and the maturity of your analytics department.
Sounds good. Just a quick reminder, we'll have a QR code at the end of this Q&A session so that you'll be able to download the playbook after this, after we answer these questions. The next question we have, how do you measure ROI and success?
Yeah, so I think when we're looking at ROI, I think it's really important to go back to that iterative process we talked about before, because every piece of data that we change, there's probably some different KPI that we want to measure with that. So there's organizational KPIs, right? If we look at just minimizing cost or the number of miles, but there's also other metrics for success, whether that's customer satisfaction or churn and turnover at the driver level. And so I think I would establish a different KPI for each of these different studies. If we're looking at safety stock, a good metric is what is the total number of stops that we're running versus stockouts. And then if we're looking at, say, geocodes, how clean are they? How far away are we actually delivering to where we expect to deliver? And so, the hope is that reduces overall mileage, right? And so I think a good indicator is what is the total mileage of the fleet, and then how are you measuring customer satisfaction and driver churn. So you can see these pretty distinctly before and after, especially with things like stop time learning that are affecting the drivers specifically, and how much time they can spend at a customer. So I think the hardest part of measuring ROI is there a clear before? And that's one of the challenges with the data cleanup pieces is sometimes we get in and the data is really messy and the metrics aren't clear. So once the metrics are clear, then it's much easier to measure the ROI on that. And sometimes that means we're able to see the ROI in significantly more in steps 3 and 4, just because can actually measure it at that point.
Okay, great. We had one more question from the registration page. How much data quality improvement is realistic?
So that's a great question. And I think it depends on, again, that's the very consulting answer, but it depends on your data maturity level. If you're already pulling in actuals and you have integrators, so say where your trucks are, when they break a geocode, if you have telemetry on all of your different tanks, if you have trackers on your goods, then you have a lot of, you can have a lot of data. And so I think if you aren't that mature on the data side, then you can see a really significant improvement doing something like this. However, if you've taken a ton of steps, you're already auditing your data, you're already using some form of analytics, you're getting into the details, then I would expect that the improvements are a little less, but still significant. I think a good example of that is like time windows. That can be like a huge ROI if you're just able to open that up. But again, that's not necessarily a data quality issue as much as it is like we know there's a problem and we need to open it up. So the inputs have a really large impact on the actual optimization.
All right. We did have one question come through the Q&A box. How would you tackle creating delivery zones for the first time?
So if we're looking at delivery zones, do you mean like territories, or do you mean like the specific instance of we want to get, say, to the delivery dock out back versus at the front door. I don't know if
Yeah. Maybe what we can do, we can reach out at the at the end of the webinar for this question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Perfect.
but I'm more than happy to answer that. Just want some clarification. Yeah.
Sounds great. All right, we've reached the end of the webinar. Thank you again for joining us. On the next slide, you will see a QR code that will take you to our last mile data playbook. If you'd like to learn more or discuss how these strategies can work for your organization, we'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out to Jake directly, and he will get back with you shortly. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.